On a cold December night in 1773, when the harbor winds swept through the narrow streets of Boston and the lamps flickered against the wooden walls of colonial homes, few could imagine that one of the most iconic acts of defiance in world history was about to unfold. But behind the quiet facade of the bustling port town, resentment had been simmering for years. The Boston Tea Party did not come out of nowhere. It was the result of a long, tense, and boiling struggle between the American colonists and the British Crown. It was not a spontaneous riot, nor a reckless act by a few reckless men. It was a calculated political message, crafted carefully, executed boldly, and designed to echo across an empire. To truly understand what happened on the night of December 16, 1773, we must go back to the decade of taxes, boycotts, protests, secret meetings, and rising fury that led Boston to become the spark of revolution. It begins not with tea, but with power, who had the right to rule, who had the right to tax, and who had the right to determine the destiny of a people oceans away from their monarch. Throughout the 1760s, the British Empire faced a massive financial burden from the costly 7 Years' War. To recover, Parliament turned to the colonies as a source of revenue, imposing new taxes such as the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, and later the Townshend duties. In London, these taxes seemed reasonable. In the colonies, they felt like chains. The principle at stake was simple yet powerful: no taxation without representation. The colonists believed that Parliament, where they had no elected representatives, had no moral or legal right to impose taxes upon them. And nowhere was resistance more fierce, more organized, and more passionate than in Boston. Boston was a city teeming with tension. Merchants bristled at new economic restrictions. Artisans feared losing their livelihoods. Sailors, dockworkers, and tavern keepers were stirred daily by debates in public houses. In the heart of the city, a network of resistance was forming. Leading the charge was a man whose name would echo through history: Samuel Adams, the genius of political agitation, a master of organization, and the driving force behind the Sons of Liberty. He was the architect of protest, a man who believed that ideas could be weapons and that the people could be rallied to a shared cause if the message was strong enough. By 1770, Boston had already tasted violence. The Boston Massacre left 5 colonists dead and the city in uproar. Britain, sensing the growing anger, repealed many of the Townshend taxes, except for one, the tax on tea. It remained not because it was financially important, but because Britain wanted to assert its authority. The message was clear: Parliament could tax the colonies whenever and however it pleased. The colonists read the message too, and they rejected it. For a brief moment, tensions eased. Merchants resumed trade. Life in Boston settled into a cautious normal. But this fragile peace shattered in 1773 when Britain passed the Tea Act, a law designed not to impose a new tax, but to rescue the struggling East India Company by giving it a monopoly on tea sales in America. The tea, though cheaper, still carried the hated tax. To the colonists, this was a trap. Cheaper tea would tempt Americans to accept Parliament's authority. The Tea Act was not a gift, it was a Trojan horse. Samuel Adams and the Sons of Liberty saw the danger immediately. If the colonists accepted the tea, they accepted Parliament's right to tax them. If they rejected it, they challenged the very core of British power. The moment the tea shipments were announced, Boston ignited. Town meetings erupted in debate. Newspapers printed scathing criticisms. Committees of correspondence fanned outrage across the colonies. And Samuel Adams quietly prepared for the confrontation he knew was coming. When the tea ships, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver, arrived in Boston Harbor in late November, they carried not only cargo but crisis. According to law, their cargo had to be unloaded and taxed within 20 days. If not, customs officials could seize it. The governor of Massachusetts, Thomas Hutchinson, a staunch defender of British authority, refused to let the ships return to London. The Sons of Liberty refused to let the tea be unloaded. And so, for weeks, Boston teetered between diplomacy and disaster. Crowds swelled daily around Griffin's Wharf. Meetings at the Old South Meeting House, some attended by over 5,000 colonists, roared with speeches and resolutions. The people demanded the ship's departure. The governor stood firm. The merchants sympathized with the protesters but feared the consequences, and the British military watched tensely from the nearby barracks. By December 16th, the deadline had arrived. Thousands gathered at the meeting house, the air cold, the tension electric. Samuel Adams stood before the crowd, knowing that the confrontation had reached its breaking point. After hours of debate, as the final message from Hutchinson arrived, again refusing to permit the ship's departure, Adams spoke the words that many would later believe signaled the start of the night's secret mission: "This meeting can do nothing more to save the country." What happened next was not chaos, it was quiet, coordinated action. As the crowd outside buzzed, a group of around 100 men, some disguised as Mohawk Indians, others simply concealing their identities, slipped into the streets. They were carpenters, blacksmiths, rope makers, merchants, sailors, ordinary colonists committing an extraordinary act. They moved toward Griffin's Wharf with purpose. No weapons, no violence, no drunken crowds, just discipline. The protest was not against tea, but against tyranny. The night of the Boston Tea Party was not loud. It was not a riot. It was a silent, powerful, deliberate statement. And as the moonlight reflected off the harbor waters, history was about to change forever. The night of December 16, 1773, settled cold and quiet over Boston, but beneath that stillness pulsed a determined energy. While thousands lingered outside the Old South Meeting House, murmuring anxiously and trying to read the mood of the city, a select group broke away with purposeful steps. For weeks, tensions had been building like thunderclouds, and now the moment had arrived. No more petitions, no more debates. The colonists were done waiting for British officials to compromise. They were ready to take matters into their own hands. As the men moved through the dimly lit streets, some carefully applied soot and paint to their faces, borrowing the appearance of Mohawk warriors. This disguise had less to do with fooling the British and more to do with sending a symbolic message that the colonists were beginning to see themselves as something distinct, neither fully British nor yet fully American, but something new, something determined, something fiercely protective of liberty. But most of these men were not actually hiding. Many had no disguises at all. Their identities were known to neighbors, and later, to history, though few of them would publicly admit their role until decades later, when the revolution was long won and Britain no longer held the power to punish them. When the group reached Griffin's Wharf, the harbor winds whipped hard, carrying the salty smell of the sea and the creaking of wooden ships anchored in the moonlit water. The 3 tea ships, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver, lay still, frost on their decks, their precious cargo untouched. These ships were not enemy vessels. They had been lawfully docked, their captains desperate to avoid conflict, stuck between colonial rage and British authority. But tonight, their cargo symbolized something far greater than commerce. It symbolized submission to Parliament's will. The men split into teams. Each group targeted a specific ship. They climbed aboard swiftly, some with axes, some with crowbars, some with nothing more than their gloved hands. At first, the sailors on board froze in shock. These intruders, though disguised, carried themselves with discipline and calm purpose, not the recklessness of a mob. One of the leaders, possibly Thomas Young or George Hughes, assured the bewildered crew, "We mean you no harm. Stand aside." And with that, the operation began. Barrels, chests, more accurately, of tea filled the cargo holds. Each chest weighed around 90 pounds and contained tightly packed bricks of East India Company tea. The men smashed the chests open with practiced swings, splintering the wood and spilling the tea leaves into the cold night air. Some joked that the harbor would become the largest cup of tea in the world. But the laughter was brief and nervous. This was treason, punishable by death. One by one, chest after chest was hauled to the railings. The men heaved them into the water, where the tea leaves spread like dark clouds beneath the surface. The rhythmic splash of falling chests filled the harbor, steady and relentless. The wind carried the scent of tea across the wharf, sharp and earthy, mixing with the heavy smell of salt water. It was unlike anything the harbor had ever experienced. Spectators gathered on the surrounding docks, whispering in awe. Some watched silently, understanding the gravity of the moment. Others cheered softly whenever a chest hit the water. But even among the onlookers, discipline was enforced. One young man tried to stuff handfuls of tea into his coat pocket, hoping to salvage a bit of the precious commodity. A protest leader caught him, grabbed him by the collar, and threw both the man and the stolen tea into the icy water. "We're not thieves," he shouted. "We are patriots." And the message was clear. This act was political, not personal. Nothing was to be stolen. Nothing was to be damaged except the tea itself. The light of lanterns flickered across the decks as the protest continued with precision. Despite the sheer scale of the destruction, 342 chests in total, there were no fires, no injuries, no drunken chaos. The men stayed focused. They even swept the decks afterward, making sure no loose tea remained that could later be claimed as contraband. Many remarked later that the night felt almost ceremonial, like a ritual of defiance performed with solemn purpose. British officials, stationed nearby, observed the event but hesitated to intervene. They were outnumbered, and the colonists' determination was unmistakable. Some officers debated rushing the wharf to stop the destruction. Others discouraged confrontation, fearing that any attempt to use force would ignite a citywide riot. In truth, Boston had reached a point where a single spark could have led to bloodshed. That spark was avoided, this time, because both sides were cautious, unsure, and aware of the powder keg beneath their feet. Governor Thomas Hutchinson, sitting in his home overlooking the harbor, received word of the unfolding destruction. Furious but powerless, he recognized that this act shattered the facade of British control. If the colonists could destroy valuable property from the East India Company, one of the most influential corporations in the world, without fear, what else might they do? And how would London react? By the time the last chest hit the water, the harbor was blanketed with wet tea leaves, drifting like dark snow. Some floated near the wharf. Others sank slowly, settling onto the muddy floor of the harbor. The moonlight shone faintly on the surface, its reflection rippling amidst the debris of rebellion. When the work was finished, the men quietly marched back into the city. Some returned home to their families. Others disappeared into taverns. A few walked to nearby meeting houses, where they reported the successful completion of the mission. They did not boast. They did not announce their names. They simply melted into the fabric of Boston life, ordinary citizens who had taken extraordinary action. That night, Boston went to sleep knowing something irreversible had happened. It was not simply the destruction of tea. It was the destruction of British legitimacy in the colonies. Word of the event spread quickly through whispers, letters, and newspapers. Some praised the act as bold and necessary. Others feared it had gone too far. But all agreed on one thing: nothing would be the same. Far across the Atlantic, officials in London would soon awaken to news that would shake the British Empire. They would see not just rebellion, but a direct challenge to their authority. And their response would set in motion a chain of events that would push America toward open conflict and, ultimately, revolution. The Boston Tea Party was not a riot. It was a message carved into history with the swing of an axe and the splash of tea into cold December waters. And the world would soon feel the impact. When dawn broke over Boston on December 17, 1773, the harbor looked strangely peaceful. The water was calm, reflecting the winter sun, but beneath that surface lay the soggy remains of Britain's precious cargo, hundreds of chests worth nearly $1 million in today's value. Tea leaves clung to the wharf posts and drifted ashore like darkened seaweed. The townspeople gathered along the docks, pointing at the debris with a mix of awe, pride, and anxiety. They knew something monumental had happened. What they didn't yet know was just how far the consequences would reach. As the first reports were written and sent by express riders to the other colonies, Boston's silence was broken by a rising buzz of whispers in taverns, meeting houses, and marketplaces. People repeated the details with disbelief: the organization, the discipline, the sheer scale of the destruction. Many colonists had protested taxes before, but nothing like this. This was direct, deliberate, uncompromising defiance. And unlike riots or spontaneous uprisings, this was a political act that left no room for negotiation. The message was unmistakable: the colonies would not submit to Parliament's authority over their lives and wallets. Other port cities, New York, Philadelphia, Charleston, watched Boston with cautious admiration. Some feared the Crown's wrath. Others felt the spark of inspiration. If Boston could stand up to Britain, why couldn't they? The Sons of Liberty in various colonies secretly celebrated. Committees of correspondence quickly circulated detailed accounts of the protest, shaping it into a symbol of colonial unity and resistance. Samuel Adams, working through contacts and newspapers, ensured the event was framed not as a lawless act, but as a heroic stand against tyranny. But despite the excitement, there was also worry. Merchants feared British trade sanctions. Moderates felt the destruction of private property had crossed a dangerous line. Some wealthier citizens, still loyal to the Crown, whispered that the perpetrators must be punished. Boston's political landscape fractured. Loyalists demanded order, patriots pushed for liberty. The city was now a battleground of ideology as much as politics. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, news of the Tea Party sailed toward London in the cargo holds of merchant ships. The journey took weeks, the winter winds rough and relentless. When the first reports arrived in early January 1774, Britain was stunned. The government expected minor resistance to the Tea Act, petitions, protests, maybe even boycotts, but not the destruction of company property by an organized group of colonists. The East India Company was outraged. Parliament was furious. King George III, a monarch deeply concerned with maintaining imperial authority, received the news with a firm resolve. He declared, "The die is cast. The colonies must either submit or triumph." To him and his ministers, the Boston Tea Party was not merely vandalism, it was rebellion. And rebellion, if not crushed, would spread like wildfire. British newspapers exploded with commentary. Some writers demanded harsh punishment. Others warned that excessive force could backfire. But one sentiment dominated: Britain could not allow such defiance to go unanswered. If the colonists got away with this, what next? Would they reject all British authority? Would other subjects of the empire follow their example? When Parliament convened, the debates were fierce and emotional. Many members, particularly those aligned with Prime Minister Lord North, demanded a swift and severe response. Britain was one of the most powerful empires in the world. It could not tolerate humiliation by its own colonists. They believed a display of force would bring the Americans back in line. Thus began the creation of the Coercive Acts, known in the colonies as the Intolerable Acts, a series of laws designed to punish Boston specifically and the colonies broadly. The first act closed Boston Harbor until the tea was paid for, an impossible demand, since the tea had been destroyed deliberately and publicly. With the harbor shut, thousands of workers were suddenly unemployed. Ships could not enter or leave. Trade collapsed. Boston's economy suffocated almost overnight. The second act dissolved the Massachusetts Colonial Assembly, placing the colony under direct royal control. Town meetings, once the lifeblood of New England political life, were restricted. Local governance was effectively crippled. The third act, known as the Administration of Justice Act, allowed royal officials accused of crimes in the colonies to be tried in Britain rather than in local courts. Colonists saw this as a free pass for British soldiers and administrators to escape accountability. The fourth act, the Quartering Act expansion, forced colonists to house British troops in private homes if necessary. To many Americans, this felt like an invasion of their personal lives. When the Intolerable Acts reached America in mid-1774, the reaction was explosive. Even moderates, those who had condemned the Tea Party, were outraged by Britain's heavy-handed response. The punishment was not limited to the perpetrators. It targeted an entire city, even an entire colony. This collective punishment pushed many previously hesitant colonists toward the patriot cause. Across the colonies, supplies and money poured into Massachusetts from supportive communities. Farm goods, firewood, and donations arrived daily. Colonies that were once divided by regional differences began to unite under a shared sense of injustice. If Boston falls, many declared, we all fall. The Crown had intended to isolate Boston. Instead, it sparked the beginning of American unity. In Boston itself, the atmosphere darkened. British troops patrolled the streets more aggressively. Tensions between soldiers and residents escalated. Taverns buzzed with talk of resistance, revolution, and the frightening possibility of war. Samuel Adams and John Hancock worked tirelessly to rally support, writing letters, coordinating protests, and calling for a continental meeting of representatives from all the colonies. By September 1774, representatives from 12 colonies gathered in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress, an unprecedented assembly that debated how to respond to Britain's actions. The delegates were not yet ready to declare independence, but they agreed to a collective boycott of British goods and issued a stern warning to Parliament: repeal the Intolerable Acts, or face rising resistance. Britain, however, misread the situation. Many in Parliament assumed the colonists were bluffing. They believed pressure, backed by military force, would bring the Americans back into compliance. They believed the empire was too strong, too vast, too powerful to be challenged by provincial farmers and merchants. They were wrong. The Boston Tea Party had done more than destroy tea. It had awakened a new political identity. It had transformed frustration into unity, anger into purpose, and scattered protests into organized resistance. It had set colonies on a collision course with the British Empire. As 1774 came to a close, Boston was no longer merely a city under punishment, it was the symbolic heart of American defiance. Every colony watched it closely. Every British official feared its unrest. And every patriot wondered, with a mix of hope and dread, what the next year would bring. The road to revolution had begun. By early 1775, the tension between Britain and the American colonies had grown into a taut wire stretched to its breaking point. No colony felt this more deeply than Massachusetts, and within Massachusetts, no city bore the strain more heavily than Boston. The intolerable acts had turned one of the busiest ports in North America into a paralyzed, starving community. British troops remained stationed in the city, their redcoats visible on every street corner, their muskets a constant reminder of the Crown's authority. Yet despite the military presence, Boston was not subdued. It was simmering. The Boston Tea Party had not merely angered Britain, it had emboldened the colonies. The people now understood the power of coordinated resistance. They saw what a single act of defiance could spark across continents. And although the tea itself had vanished into the cold December harbor, its impact still pulsed through every town meeting, every newspaper editorial, every whispered conversation in taverns from New England to Georgia. Britain believed it could restrain the rebellion through punishment, but punishment bred unity. London believed cutting off Boston's trade would break the city's will. Instead, it strengthened intercolonial cooperation. Wagons filled with flour, livestock, blankets, and money arrived from distant colonies, Virginia, Pennsylvania, the Carolinas, sent by ordinary people who had never set foot in Massachusetts but felt a shared sense of injustice. The Tea Party had awakened something extraordinary. The colonies were beginning to realize they were not isolated entities, but a collective with shared interests, shared grievances, and shared dreams of political freedom. As winter turned to spring, political leaders across the colonies knew they had to take decisive action. The First Continental Congress, held in Philadelphia in late 1774, had laid the foundation for a coordinated response to Britain's crackdown. Delegates debated fiercely. Some favored reconciliation. Others insisted on preparing for confrontation. Yet one agreement emerged clearly. The colonies would not submit to the intolerable acts. And if Britain pushed harder, the colonies would push back. In Boston, Samuel Adams, John Hancock, and other patriot leaders understood the stakes. They continued their work quietly and efficiently. While Adams wrote letters and speeches that urged unity, Hancock used his wealth to support the patriot cause. The Sons of Liberty grew bolder, organizing committees, spreading information, and training local militias. The people knew that talk might not be enough. If Britain brought force, they had to be ready. The British military leadership in the colonies also recognized the growing danger. General Thomas Gage, the commander-in-chief of British forces in North America and the governor of Massachusetts, faced an impossible task. He was expected to enforce the intolerable acts, maintain order, and suppress rebellion, all without provoking open warfare. Yet Boston was a powder keg, and Gage could feel the sparks gathering. In April 1775, Gage made a fateful decision. He ordered British troops to march to Concord, a small town about 20 miles west of Boston, to seize a cache of colonial weapons and arrest key patriot leaders. The mission was meant to be swift, quiet, and decisive. But nothing in Massachusetts remained secret for long. The network of patriot spies, some stationed inside Boston, others in taverns and post offices, tracked every British movement. As soon as the redcoats prepared to march, riders were already spreading the alarm. The most famous of them, of course, was Paul Revere, a Boston silversmith and longtime member of the Sons of Liberty. On the night of April 18th, he crossed the Charles River and rode into the countryside, shouting warnings that would echo for centuries. The British are coming. But he was not alone. Dozens of riders fanned out across the countryside, turning the night into a web of signals and messages. By dawn, when British troops reached Lexington, they found armed colonists waiting. These were not trained soldiers. They were farmers, shopkeepers, blacksmiths, ordinary men prepared to defend their rights. The tension was suffocating. A single misstep could ignite violence. And then, from an unknown source, a gunshot rang out. The shot heard round the world was not metaphorical, it was literal. It marked the beginning of the American Revolutionary War. Though the skirmish at Lexington was brief, the conflict escalated rapidly as British troops moved on to Concord. There, colonial militias fought back fiercely, forcing the British into a long, bloody retreat back to Boston. The countryside erupted with armed resistance. British officers realized with shock that they were not fighting scattered mobs. They were fighting a people prepared to stand their ground. When the surviving redcoats staggered into Boston that evening, exhausted and bloodied, the city was instantly transformed. Militia bands from across New England began to surround Boston, forming what became known as the Siege of Boston. Within days, tens of thousands of colonists took up positions on the hills surrounding the city, effectively trapping the British forces inside. The Boston Tea Party had not directly caused the battles of Lexington and Concord, but it had set the chain of events in motion. Without the Tea Party, there would have been no intolerable acts. Without the intolerable acts, there would have been no First Continental Congress. Without the Congress, no unified colonial response. And without that unity, the militias might never have been prepared to rise so quickly or so decisively. Now Boston found itself at the heart of a war. British ships filled the harbor. Soldiers patrolled the narrow streets. But the hills around the city now belonged to the Patriots. Just weeks after the skirmishes at Lexington and Concord, the colonists seized Breed's Hill, a position near Charlestown. The British, determined to break the siege, launched an assault in June 1775. The ensuing conflict, known as the Battle of Bunker Hill, was one of the bloodiest early battles of the Revolution. Although the British technically won the hill, they suffered enormous losses, proving once and for all that the colonists were not amateurs, but a fighting force capable of standing against one of the world's greatest armies. As the war unfolded, news of the conflict spread across the colonies and across the Atlantic. Britain prepared for a full-scale military campaign to crush the rebellion. The colonists prepared for a long fight for freedom. And through all of this, the memory of the Boston Tea Party became a rallying symbol, an example of ordinary citizens taking an extraordinary stand, a reminder that resistance could become revolution. In the months that followed, the Continental Congress appointed George Washington as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. Militias became regiments. Supplies were gathered. Diplomats began to seek foreign support. The colonies were not yet united as a nation, but the seeds of unity had been planted. By early 1776, the siege of Boston intensified. Washington implemented bold strategies to fortify the surrounding positions. In March, under the cover of darkness, the Continental Army moved artillery to Dorchester Heights, giving them a commanding view of the British fleet. Seeing that the colonial guns could devastate the ships in the harbor, the British realized they could no longer hold the city. On March 17, 1776, they withdrew. Boston was free. And so, astonishingly, the city where the conflict had begun, where tea had been dumped, where troops had fired into crowds, where trade had been strangled, became the first major American victory of the Revolutionary War. But the story was far from over. The colonies were still technically British subjects, still fighting without a clear declaration of independence. Yet the momentum toward nationhood was growing rapidly. The people who had once thrown tea into the harbor now saw themselves not as rebels, but as future citizens of a free country. The question remaining was simple, but world-changing. Would the colonies dare to declare independence? As 1776 dawned, the American colonies stood at a crossroads. The battles at Lexington, Concord, and Bunker Hill had proven that this was no fleeting rebellion, it was a war. Boston had been freed, but the British Empire was preparing a massive counteroffensive. Warships were being deployed, armies were being raised, and Parliament was determined to crush resistance once and for all. Yet amid the cannon smoke and political chaos, one event continued to echo louder than all others: the Boston Tea Party. In the minds of many Americans, the Tea Party had become more than a protest, it was a declaration of identity. It marked the moment ordinary people decided they had the right to shape their own destiny. It was not led by generals or aristocrats, but by craftsmen, sailors, merchants, and farmers. It was a reminder that revolutionary ideas often come from the streets, from regular citizens who refused to bow to injustice. And it was this spirit, not military might, that would ultimately guide the colonies toward independence. Throughout the winter and spring of 1776, the Continental Congress in Philadelphia debated the fate of the colonies. Breaking away from Britain was a terrifying idea. The British Empire was vast, wealthy, and militarily powerful. Declaring independence would mean a fight to the death. But every time the question of loyalty or submission arose, someone inevitably brought up Boston. Someone reminded the delegates of the tea floating in the harbor, the intolerable acts, the closed port, the occupation, and the blood spilled on Lexington Green. The Tea Party was proof that reconciliation was no longer possible. Britain had shown, through punishment and force, that it would not treat the colonies as equals. And the colonies, through defiance and unity, had shown they would no longer accept subordination. In June 1776, a committee that included Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, and Robert Livingston was tasked with drafting a formal document of separation. Jefferson, the gifted writer of the group, took the lead. As he wrote the now famous words about natural rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, he was giving voice to the very ideas that had animated the colonists who climbed aboard the Dartmouth, Eleanor, and Beaver 3 years earlier. When the Declaration of Independence was adopted on July 4, 1776, it did more than announce a break from Britain. It crystallized the ideals that had already been lived out on Boston's wharf, the belief that unjust authority could be resisted, that government must be based on consent, and that ordinary people had both the right and the duty to defend their liberty. Yet even as the new nation took shape, the consequences of the Tea Party continued to evolve. The war raged on, brutal and uncertain. Cities burned, soldiers froze in winter camps, families were torn apart by loyalty and ideology. But Boston's example continued to inspire perseverance. The Tea Party became a moral justification for sacrifice, proof that freedom required courage. By 1783, when the Treaty of Paris officially ended the Revolutionary War, the United States of America stood victorious. The impossible had been achieved. A group of former colonies had defeated one of the mightiest empires in history. But to understand how that victory became possible, one must look not only at the battlefield but at the symbolic turning points that gave the people their resolve. And few were more important than that December night in 1773. After the war, the Boston Tea Party entered American memory not simply as an act of rebellion, but as a national legend. Participants who had once concealed their identities began to speak openly about their roles. Men like George Hughes retold the events in vivid detail, allowing future generations to understand the discipline and purpose behind the protest. Artists painted scenes of the Tea Party, often dramatizing it, emphasizing the bravery of the participants. Writers described it as a bold stroke against tyranny, and politicians invoked it whenever debates about liberty arose. But with time came reinterpretation. Some saw the Tea Party as proof of America's willingness to challenge corruption and concentrated power. Others viewed it as an early example of resistance against corporate monopolies. Still others saw it as a reminder of how fragile liberty is, and how easily it can be eroded if people remain silent. The event became something larger than the destruction of tea. It became a lens through which Americans viewed themselves. In the 19th century, as the nation expanded westward and debated issues of slavery, industrialization, and federal power, the Tea Party remained a symbol of resistance and civic duty. During the Civil War, both Union and Confederate leaders invoked the spirit of the Tea Party to justify their causes, proof that the symbolism was powerful enough to be interpreted in multiple ways. In the 20th century, the Boston Tea Party became a staple of textbooks, museums, and patriotic celebrations. Millions of schoolchildren learned how ordinary colonists had disguised themselves as Mohawks, boarded ships, and defiantly dumped tea into the ocean. Boston, proud of its revolutionary heritage, built monuments, reenacted the event annually, and preserved the Old South Meeting House where the spark was struck. The Tea Party transformed from a local protest into a foundational chapter of American identity. Even in the 21st century, more than 200 years later, the phrase Tea Party still carries political weight. Activist groups of various kinds have adopted the name, drawing inspiration, sometimes directly, sometimes symbolically, from the 1773 protest. The phrase continues to evoke ideas of resistance, taxation, freedom, and the rights of citizens against powerful institutions. Few events in world history have enjoyed such a long and evolving legacy. Yet through all its interpretations, one thing remains constant. The Boston Tea Party was an extraordinary act of political courage. It was carried out by ordinary people who felt unheard, underestimated, and overruled. They believed that their rights mattered, that their voices deserved representation, and that power must be accountable to the people it governs. Their act was not the beginning of anger, but the beginning of a nation. In the end, the importance of the Boston Tea Party lies not in the destruction of tea or the loss of revenue to Britain. It lies in the message sent across the Atlantic and into the future, that liberty is worth fighting for, that the power of the people is real, and that a small group with conviction can change the course of history. The tea leaves that floated across Boston Harbor on that freezing night in 1773 did more than stain the water. They stirred the currents of revolution. They carried with them the seeds of a country that would grow, evolve, struggle, and strive toward the ideals first whispered in taverns and shouted in meeting houses. And those ideals, born in the shadows of the wharf, would shape the destiny of a nation, and the world, for centuries to come.